The Uncharted Future, a collection of sci-fi visions by Rainer Yeah. This short story is called Nero-Rest. In 2035, the Institute for Neural Optimization announced a breakthrough. After years of research into the human sleep cycle and brain function, they unveiled a new technology that promised to eliminate the need for natural sleep. It was a compound called Nero-Rest delivered through a daily injection. The compound didn't simply replace sleep. It altered the brain's natural processes, simulating the same restorative effects sleep had on the body and mind. The compound worked by targeting areas of the brain involved in sleep regulation, specifically the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, both known for their roles in controlling sleep patterns. Nero-Rest disrupted the production of adenosine, the neurotransmitter responsible for the feeling of tiredness, and boosted the efficiency of synaptic homeostasis, which is the brain's way of maintaining and pruning neural connections during sleep. The compound stimulated the brain's glymphatic system, which clears away waste products that build up during waking hours. This was one of the major breakthroughs in Nero-Rest. It mimicked the brain's natural cleaning processes, ensuring that neural cells were kept functioning at optimal levels without needing to enter the deep stages of sleep. The body, meanwhile, remained active, metabolism ticking along as if fully rested. The Institute's lead researchers emphasized the potential. With Nero-Rest, humans could now function around the clock. No downtime. Work could continue without interruption. The human brain could stay sharp, the body energized, as if refreshed from a full night of sleep. But in reality, not a single hour had been lost. It wasn't long before pharmaceutical companies seized the opportunity. Leading corporations began mass-producing the compound, branding it as the solution to human limitations. They marketed Nero-Rest to companies and individuals who wanted to push the boundaries of productivity. It became a key player in industries already dominated by AI-driven efficiency, where automated systems had replaced much of the repetitive labor and decision-making. With AI handling more of the work, humans found themselves in highly specialized, creative, or decision-intensive roles that demanded constant engagement. Time was the only resource that still limited human potential. Nero-Rest offered a way to bypass that. Pharmaceutical companies framed it as a competitive advantage. The world's top CEOs and financial moguls were the first to adopt it, boasting about their increased focus and endless energy. The sales pitch was clear. Without the need for sleep, humans could achieve more, produce more, and take on more responsibilities. Entire corporations began pushing the drug onto their employees as part of workplace optimization programs. But the availability of Nero-Rest was limited. It wasn't designed for everyone. The drug was expensive, well beyond the reach of the general population. The wealthy elite adopted it immediately, reshaping their lives around a new 24-hour cycle. They expanded their work weeks, cut down on leisure time, and plunged into the new era of ceaseless productivity. Pharmaceutical companies raised prices as demand surged, ensuring that the drug remained a luxury. For the poor and working class, Nero-Rest was unattainable. Even as automated systems and AI replaced more jobs, humans were expected to keep pace with the ever-expanding work hours of their superiors. Those who couldn't afford Nero-Rest fell behind. Companies began to favor employees who used the drug, creating a two-tiered workforce. The upper echelon thrived in the synthetic sleep era, while those without access to the drug struggled to keep up. Nero-Rest became more than a productivity tool. It became a status symbol. In the wealthiest sectors, it wasn't just about working longer hours. It was about being seen as someone who didn't need to stop, someone who was above the natural limitations of the human body. Conferences, meetings, and social gatherings became 24-hour affairs. It was common for elite professionals to attend business meetings at 3 a.m. with no noticeable signs of fatigue. Meanwhile, entire sectors of society were left behind. For the poor, sleep was still a necessity. The physical need for rest became a marker of economic status. Those who couldn't afford Nero-Rest found themselves forced into lower-paying, menial jobs where the demands were fewer, but the consequences of exhaustion were high. As the wealth gap grew, so did the sleep gap. Despite the early success of Nero-Rest, reports of side effects began to emerge. The first sign came from low-level workers who had been pushed into longer hours without proper access to rest. Their bodies showed signs of wear. Muscles weakened, immune systems faltered. While the brain functioned under Nero-Rest, the body still required some of the regenerative effects of deep sleep. Without it, subtle damage began to accumulate. These issues, however, were ignored by the elite and the corporations profiting from the drug. Instead, pharmaceutical companies doubled down, creating new versions of Nero-Rest designed to mitigate the physical strain on the body. The updated versions became even more expensive, accessible only to those at the highest levels of society. The poor, who could neither afford the drug nor escape the demands of a society that no longer respected sleep, suffered most. Jobs that once offered regular rest breaks no longer existed. Overnight shifts in warehouses and factories, those still operated by humans, stretched into double or triple shifts. The wealthy employed Nero-Rest to stay ahead, and the poor struggled just to survive. As the years went on, the divide between those who used Nero-Rest and those who couldn't became clearer. The rich lived longer, healthier lives, while the poor experienced higher rates of burnout, illness, and early death. Sleep, once a shared human experience, had become another way to measure inequality. But the issues with Nero-Rest went beyond economic disparity. Researchers, once advocates of synthetic sleep, began noticing subtler problems. While the compound kept the brain functioning, it didn't replicate all the benefits of natural rest. REM sleep, the stage critical for memory consolidation and emotional regulation, was completely bypassed by Nero-Rest. People began reporting issues with long-term memory. They found it difficult to recall experiences or learned information. A more worrying trend emerged as more data was collected. Neurodegenerative diseases were on the rise among long-term users. The synaptic pruning and waste clearance provided by sleep were no longer fully active, and neural pathways started to degrade. Scientists debated whether this was reversible with periods of natural sleep, but for many, the damage had already been done. Cognitive drift, once dismissed as a minor issue, became a recognized condition. Those who had relied on Nero-Rest for too long found it harder to focus, harder to distinguish between past and present events. The brain, pushed to stay active beyond its natural limits, couldn't process information properly. Doctors and scientists proposed that while Nero-Rest kept the brain firing, it failed to preserve the intricate web of synaptic connections that made memory, identity, and self-awareness possible. Governments responded with half-hearted regulations, advising against continuous use of the drug, but the damage was done. Entire industries had restructured around the idea of synthetic sleep. Reversing that trend was impossible. Corporations needed their workers awake. The economy needed people producing at all hours. Sleep, for those who could afford to avoid it, had become a thing of the past. But beneath the surface, a crisis was brewing. The elite continued pushing ahead, unaware of the long-term costs of Nero-Rest, while the poor were left to shoulder the burden of both economic and physical collapse. The world was awake, but it was also beginning to shatter. As the world adapted to synthetic sleep, the consequences became harder to ignore. The divide between those who relied on Nero-Rest and those who couldn't afford it deepened, turning sleep into a social marker of status. But beyond the obvious social divisions, the strain on society as a whole began to surface. Cities that had once thrived on the ceaseless activity of their always-awake population started to show signs of breaking down. Infrastructure, once maintained by human oversight, then partially by AI, was faltering. While automated systems handled much of the logistics, energy distribution, and maintenance of urban spaces, they still required occasional human intervention. The continuous pace brought on by synthetic sleep had stretched human workers thin. The cracks in the system grew more obvious every year. Reports of errors in automated factories, power grids, and even AI-controlled medical systems increased. With humans constantly awake, the systems built to maintain the world were subjected to never-ending strain, more than they had ever been designed to handle. As fewer people maintained proper sleep cycles, errors in judgment and decision-making became more frequent. A power failure in one city would cascade into neighboring areas, leading to frequent blackouts. Transportation systems designed to operate without interruption failed more often as their human operators struggled with cognitive drift. People in the upper tiers of society who had embraced Nero-Rest began to experience the longer-term effects of the drug. While they stayed awake and productive, they found themselves increasingly detached from the world around them. Memory gaps became larger. They couldn't recall basic details about their lives. Emotions flattened. The decision-making skills that had once driven their businesses and industries faltered. CEOs forgot key meetings or confused critical projects. Workers, especially those in creative or high-pressure fields, noticed their once sharp minds becoming dulled by a constant stream of work. A new term, emotional suppression syndrome, ESS, began to circulate. People who had used Nero-Rest for extended periods found that they could no longer connect with others emotionally or relationships, once based on shared experiences, memory, and empathy, started to erode. Users of the drug lost interest in family and friends. Marriages broke down. Friendships became hollow. It wasn't that they didn't care. They simply couldn't engage. Scientists studying the long-term impacts of Nero-Rest pointed to the bypassing of REM sleep as a key cause. REM sleep had been crucial for processing emotions and integrating them into memory. Without it, the mind failed to consolidate emotional experiences. Over time, emotional responses to everyday situations weakened. People became mechanical, focused purely on tasks, lacking the capacity to reflect, connect, or feel. At the same time, a new industry emerged: memory enhancement clinics. These clinics promised to restore some of what had been lost. People could pay for treatments that would stimulate neural connections and attempt to reintegrate memories. For the wealthy, these clinics offered a temporary fix, a way to regain fragments of the person they had once been. But for the poor, this was another service out of reach. Public unrest grew. The working class, those who hadn't been able to afford Nero-Rest, found themselves struggling to survive in a society that no longer valued them. The labor market was dominated by those who could work around the clock, creating a pool of permanently unemployed left behind in the race for productivity. Many began organizing, forming grassroots movements to push back against the growing inequities. Their protests centered around the idea that natural sleep was a basic human right, a necessity for survival and well-being. But the powerful corporations behind Nero-Rest resisted these calls. Their profits depended on the continued use of synthetic sleep, and their lobbyists kept governments from enacting strict regulations. The wealthy, living in their gated communities, had little incentive to listen to the concerns of the masses. But even among the wealthy, problems started to occur. The most affluent had access to the latest Nero-Rest upgrades, but they too were starting to feel the strain. The effects of cognitive drift and emotional suppression syndrome couldn't be ignored forever. High-level decision-makers began making catastrophic mistakes. A series of failed business deals led to economic ripples that affected entire industries. Financial markets became unpredictable as the minds at the top faltered. Scientists, once optimistic about synthetic sleep, were now at the forefront of a growing call for change. They argued that human biology had evolved over millennia, shaped by the need for rest. By bypassing sleep, society had pushed its mind and body to the breaking point. A new report from the Global Neuroscience Institute warned that, without immediate changes, a global crisis in mental health and productivity was inevitable. At the same time, automated systems, once hailed as the future of work, were struggling to compensate for human error. AI, while efficient, relied on the oversight of humans to handle complex, delicate problems. But with so many workers experiencing cognitive drift, the errors piled up. Factories began miscalculating production quotas, power grids overloaded, and entire industries stumbled. It became clear that humans were losing their ability to function effectively, even with AI support. The world was at a tipping point. The poor, left out of the synthetic sleep revolution, grew more desperate. The rich, realizing the damage to their minds, sought increasingly desperate measures to regain control of their lives, and the middle class, caught in the crossfire, struggled in a world that no longer made sense. Governments were forced to step in, but their solutions were limited. They tried to roll back the use of Nero-Rest, but the system had become too dependent on it. Banning the compound would cause economic collapse. Yet continuing its use would only worsen the mental degradation sweeping through society. In a final effort, a coalition of scientists, ethicists, and human rights organizations pushed for a global regulation of synthetic sleep. Their proposal was simple. Limit the use of Nero-Rest to critical emergency situations and restore the natural sleep cycle as the foundation of human life. They argued that while technology had advanced beyond imagination, human consciousness had not kept pace. But by then it was too late for many. Entire sectors of society had been shaped by the absence of sleep, and the process of unwinding that damage was a monumental task. The world had stayed awake too long. And now the consequences were irreversible. The catastrophe began as a series of small, seemingly unrelated events. Systems that had once operated with flawless precision began to fail in unpredictable ways. It started with a global satellite network responsible for guiding thousands of autonomous vehicles across the world. One by one, the satellites fell out of sync with each other. The cause was traced back to a small team of engineers who, suffering from cognitive drift, had made critical errors during routine maintenance. The disruption threw entire cities into chaos. Autonomous cars, trucks, and drones malfunctioned. Some stopped in place, blocking highways and city streets. Others veered off course, causing collisions that spread panic through the system. In the following days, power grids across multiple continents began experiencing cascading failures. A group of technicians in North America, using Nero-Rest for months, had miscalculated load distributions during a heatwave, causing the region's grid to overload. As power stations failed, blackouts spread across major cities. Hospitals reliant on continuous power were forced to operate on emergency backups. But with cognitive drift affecting everyone from doctors to engineers, mistakes in managing the blackout led to life-threatening consequences. Patients in critical care units died as backup generators failed to switch on. In some places, entire buildings were cut off from power for days. Governments scrambled to control the situation, but the leaders, many of whom had also relied on synthetic sleep, struggled to make coherent decisions. Policy meetings stretched into the night, filled with conflicting statements and memory lapses. Emergency responses were delayed as ministers and officials failed to recall critical protocols. The once efficient network of global leadership was reduced to confusion and hesitation. The catastrophe reached its peak when an oil refinery in the Middle East exploded, sending shockwaves across the region. Investigators later found that the explosion had been caused by an AI-controlled system that had malfunctioned, receiving faulty input from a human supervisor. The supervisor, who had been awake for nearly a year on Nero-Rest, had been unable to perceive the growing instability in the refinery's core systems. The blast ignited a chain reaction, causing fires that raged for days that spread toxic fumes into the air. The explosion triggered panic on a global scale. Stock markets collapsed as investors withdrew from industries reliant on human labor. Global supply chains, already weakened by cognitive drift and the satellite network failure, ground to a halt. Food shortages became widespread as transport systems broke down. The world, once connected by logistics and AI-driven automation, was now fragmented, unable to maintain the delicate balance of global trade. The financial collapse hit hardest in urban centers where synthetic sleep had been most prevalent. People, no longer capable of focusing on even the simplest tasks, were left wandering through darkened streets, unable to find their way home. Factories stopped producing goods. Automated grocery deliveries halted. Without the power grid, water purification systems failed. Basic utilities once taken for granted disappeared overnight. The poor, who had been left out of the Nero-Rest revolution, were hit hardest by the shortages. In cities where food had already been scarce, riots broke out. People stormed stores and warehouses, desperate for supplies. But the infrastructure that once supported them was no longer functioning. The automated farming systems designed to produce endless crops without human input had also begun to fail as maintenance crews made one mistake after another. In wealthier districts where residents had once prided themselves on their ceaseless productivity, the effects of cognitive drift were undeniable. People stood in the streets, staring blankly at malfunctioning drones and vehicles. Homes that had been built without bedrooms or spaces for rest now stood as hollow monuments to a society that had forgotten the value of sleep. The rich, who had relied on Nero-Rest to push ahead of the rest of society, were now trapped in their own nightmare. Hospitals, overwhelmed with patients suffering from cognitive drift, became battlegrounds. People who had used synthetic sleep for too long began to exhibit severe neurological symptoms. Hallucinations blurred the lines between reality and memory. Patients screamed about events that had never happened or spoke of loved ones who didn't exist. Doctors themselves, suffering from the effects of Nero-Rest, struggled to keep up with the influx of cases. Without proper sleep cycles, their treatments grew increasingly erratic. Some patients slipped into irreversible comas, their minds unable to reconnect with the physical world. With no clear way to reverse the damage, scientists began to consider the unthinkable: the long-term collapse of human cognition. The brain, pushed beyond its biological limits, had degraded to a point where recovery was impossible for many. The neural synchronization device, once heralded as a potential solution, had been abandoned in the wake of increasing reports of failures. People who had used it found that while it could temporarily stabilize memory, it couldn't restore the deeper emotional and cognitive functions lost over time. Some isolated communities, who had rejected NeuroRest early on, managed to survive relatively unscathed. These communities, largely rural and self-sufficient, had continued to practice natural sleep cycles, relying on older technologies and localized food production. While they experienced some disruptions due to the global catastrophe, their ability to function independently of the synthetic sleep economy allowed them to maintain stability. Word of these communities spread, and some fled the cities in search of refuge. Dysfunctional governments attempted to regain control by instituting strict rationing and curfews. Military forces were deployed to restore order in urban centers, but even they were not immune to the effects of cognitive drift. Soldiers made critical errors in judgment, leading to clashes with civilians and further unrest. As the global situation deteriorated, scientists convened one final emergency summit to determine if there was any way to reverse the effects of Nero-Rest. After weeks of debate, they reached a terrible conclusion. The only hope for recovery was a complete societal shift back to natural sleep. But doing so would require decades of rebuilding, during which much of the damage would be irreversible. There was no quick fix. The world had stayed awake too long, and now the cost of that decision was being paid in lives. The world that had once thrived on ceaseless productivity, powered by synthetic sleep and AI-driven labor, had been brought to its knees by the very systems it had created. People who had embraced the promise of endless waking hours now faced a future where the ability to sleep and to dream was all that could save what remained of human consciousness. The catastrophe of synthetic sleep had reshaped the world forever. The question that remained was whether humanity could rebuild itself in the wake of its own ambition, or whether it was already too late. As an end result, humanity was forced to rebuild, but not as it once had. Governments collapsed, and what remained of society shattered into smaller, self-sustaining communities. Those who survived abandoned synthetic sleep entirely, returning to natural cycles of rest. Cities, once alive 24 hours a day, became quiet as night returned to its rightful place. Scientists worked to salvage what they could of human cognition, but the damage done by Nero-Rest was irreversible for many. The world shrank, global networks broke down, and the age of ceaseless progress ended. The era of synthetic sleep had promised boundless productivity, but it had cost humanity its mind. In the end, what remained were people who had learned a bitter truth. Some limits cannot be surpassed without consequence. The world, now quieter and smaller, moved forward more slowly, with sleep as the last refuge of those who survived.